Well, welcome back to the second volume of Faculty in Focus, where we blur the lines between the work done by Ohio State Lima faculty and the greater Allen County community. I'm your host, Maggie Young, and throughout Faculty in Focus, we will explore Ohio State Lima faculty interests and how they relate to the greater Allen County region. For our second volume of Faculty in Focus, we decided to talk about faculty firsts. There's so much excitement and newness with the start of a new school year. I thought it might be interesting to look at how our faculty developed their teaching and research skills. Today, we have Dr. Virginia Tompkins, an associate professor of psychology, and she's going to share a bit about her first experiences with research and how that research has developed over time. So Virginia, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you got interested in the research process?
Sure. So as an undergraduate student in psychology, as many of our students do here at OSU Lima, I got involved in a faculty member's research lab. And that project was looking at older adults and memory training. So trying to show older adults that they can improve their memory skills with some basic training. So that was my first step into research. It wasn't honestly really what interested me, but it led me to pursue graduate study in developmental psychology. And after taking some other coursework focused on children, that really led me to develop more interest in the earlier period of the lifespan. And so once I got into graduate school, I started to explore that area of the lifespan more, early childhood, and that led me to my first independent project, which was my master's thesis.
So can I just ask just a little bit about, so how did you get involved with that faculty mentor and get involved in that research process like initially? And what did you do with that faculty member?
Sure. So as we encourage students to do here, if you have an interest in going to graduate school in psychology, we very much emphasize getting involved in a research project, even if it isn't necessarily the thing that you're passionate about. So honestly, that was so long ago. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I think I probably just approached the faculty member because she had an opening in our lab, and it was something I was interested in. And then I really got to do all parts of the research data collection process because she trained us to go to these communities with older residents and engage them in these memory training programs. And then we would test their skills before and after. So it was pretty hands-on. I got to collect the data and then a lot of work in the lab as well, entering in the data. So as we tell students here, it doesn't have to be something that you see yourself doing for the long term. It's really just about getting in the door and helping with a research project to see sort of the ins and outs of it. And then you can decide for yourself what area you want to go in.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, getting your feet wet and getting involved in all those different processes or the different steps in the processes. Well, I think it's always fun. So I'm, maybe that's showing my own interest here. So you mentioned that first independent project. And I think you said it was in your master's program. So can you tell us a little bit more about it? What was it? Who was involved? What were you trying to study or figure out?
Sure. So in my graduate program, which was a PhD program in developmental psychology, the tradition was to do like a first year project that wasn't really your independent work, but usually your advisor's work. So my advisor was working with kids that have language impairments in a speech and hearing clinic. It was about an hour away from campus. And so I helped with the data collection with that project. But my first independent project was when it came time to determine what I was doing for my master's thesis. I was interested in the narrative skills of children with language impairment and how that might make it more difficult to produce narratives. And so although that wasn't what my quote unquote first year project was about, I was interested in that same population of children who have language impairments and how their narratives might be facilitated by sharing stories with their parents, specifically looking at a book together that didn't have words, so they had to create the narrative, and then also reminiscing narratives, which hadn't been studied in that population. So talking about the things that they had done together in the past. So I kind of branched off of that by looking at the same population, but developed a sort of entirely different research focus for that master's thesis.
Oh, that's awesome. So the idea of like formulating words for the stories that they are either running on like in their heads, like is that what you were focusing on, or really just articulating? Can they articulate the words that they? they need to in
Right.
order to communicate?
So these were kids that had a specific disorder called, at the time, it was called specific language disorder. Now it's actually called something different, but these are kids that had sometimes receptive vocabulary skills that were on average, but their syntactic skills and their narrative skills are where they often struggle. So formulating like the structure of the narrative was something that they had more difficulty with. And so I wanted to see how that would compare in these different narrative formats. It was more difficult for them to talk about something from the past because they have to, there's no scaffolding like in a book where there's pictures and they can just describe the story. Those past events are actually very difficult for them to do, even with their mother's help. But they did much better with the mother's influence compared to a condition where they were just telling the stories to an experimenter where they had to do all of the recollection. So those were the main comparisons, the book and the reminiscing, and then the mother versus doing it independently.
Oh, incredible. What did you find?
So in the reminiscing literature, which is something I still study to this day, years and years later.
Just a couple years later.
Often we find that it's the moms who ask more of the elaborative questions that get kids engaged in the conversation. But what we found with the kids with language impairments is that it wasn't just the elaborative questions, it was also the more repetitive questions, which is typically seen as like an inferior kind of a narrative scaffolding when you just kind of repeat the same question over and over again.
Like, can you give an example of that? Like, and then what, and what came next? Is it that kind of question?
Well, so if we're talking about reminiscing, it might be like, do you remember when we went to Disney World? What did we do that first day? And the child maybe can't recall anything. So a repetitive question would mean that they just repeat the question. Can't you remember? Tell me what we did that day. And so with typically developing children, we see that those kinds of questions actually don't facilitate their narrative recall. But with the kids with language impairment, they actually needed that extra repetition to get them talking about the event. And we found that it was actually related to their ability to contribute, unlike it is with typically developing children. So it just suggests that the ways that parents get their kids talking in these narrative formats might differ depending on the child's language skill.
Wow. Oh, that's so interesting. Awesome. Okay, so you had that first independent research project as part of your master's program. So then what happened next? Did you immediately jump into your next project, or were you involved in other things with other researchers, or what came next?
So in my program, because it was a PhD program, the dissertation follows. I do want to back up for a second and just point out that the master's project took a lot longer than I anticipated. So it took a very long time, but I only had 7 participants because it was such a specialized population that it was very difficult to recruit parents who are willing to do this. And so I just want to point out to others who are interested in research, like lesson learned, perseverance. I mean, eventually the project was completed, it was published, even with 7 participants, like it was successful in the end. But in the midst of it, it was a really big struggle to get it done. But yes, then the dissertation followed and that went a lot more quickly. And so I decided not to work with that special population for my dissertation because of those challenges, and I wanted to get it done. But I studied similar kinds of skills in the dissertation, so looking at parent-child narratives in the different formats, book reading, reminiscing, and looking at how it related to children's language and literacy skills.
So did you take a similar kind of similar approach, or was it a completely different kind of project?
It was a very similar approach because I've always been interested in the different narrative contexts. And so I did the reminiscing, but also the storybook reading, and then I added a play narrative interaction, and then looked at language and literacy outcomes. So I was able to do more than I did with the special population as far as collecting multiple measures of their language skills, but it was very similar, just with a typically developing preschool population instead of the language impaired kids, because it turned out to be quite a chore to find kids who qualify, really, because it was a very specific diagnosis. These are kids that actually have normal intelligence, they just have a specific impairment in a certain kind of language.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that would be challenging to find all of the participants and then to get them to agree to participate and to follow through with the entire project. Yeah. Anyone who does research realizes how difficult it can be to recruit and retain participants for the remainder of the study.
Exactly. And that speech and hearing clinic made it a little bit easier, but it was an hour drive from where I was studying. So, add 2 hours to any day that you're going to go down there to collect data.
Right. In the midst of graduate school, which is challenging in and of itself. So, yeah. All right. Well, yes, a lesson in tenacity and perseverance. So we established that, your doctoral program, was just a couple years ago. How have your research interests or trajectory, how has that changed since then? Or has it kind of continued along similar lines?
It has continued along similar lines. I would say that, one thing that has changed is just maybe broadening my scope a little bit, recognizing that finding children and families to participate in research is maybe not always the easiest. So, many of my colleagues in psychology who study adults would, recruit undergraduate students, for example, on campus to participate in research. And so I've done a little bit with expanding my research questions to include adult populations, for example. So some of the topics that I'm interested in childhood, I can also look at it in adulthood. So although that wasn't, my original focus, I've expanded a little bit just to make things feasible at times and to keep the momentum of research going while I sort of collect the more challenging populations, which is usually children and families are a little more challenging because of the time constraints of getting families either to come to campus or for us to go to them.
Wonderful. All right. So the last question that I have for you today is what advice do you have for aspiring researchers?
I would say that they really just need to get in the door of a research lab, get involved, talk to the professors that they have classes with, that they think they might be interested in working with. As I was saying before, it's pretty unlikely that a student would have the exact interests of any one of us, but that doesn't really matter. You just need to get research experience and it would be pretty similar, regardless of which lab you join as far as what kinds of skills you would be exposed to. Something I'm focusing on this semester with my research assistants is not so much the content of what we're doing. I mean, that's important, but emphasizing to them how these skills will carry across, other job related outcomes like learning basic, Excel and data entry and statistical software, those kinds of things can apply to a wide range of things. And that's really what graduate programs are looking for. If students are interested in research, they really need to get into a research experience of some kind.
Well, then, and also like on the tail end of the research process, it's the communicating. It's the communicating out what it is that you found. And so creating graphics or kind of sharing your results, that kind of verbal communication or written communication as well, kind of helps add some additional depth to their skill development.
Exactly. And that's something that students often are a little hesitant about because that's a little intimidating to them, but it's really our job to hold their hand along the way and to give them the confidence to, show that they can do this, they've got this, and we obviously help them to develop those skills so that when they get to that point of communicating the results, they're well prepared for it.
Right. And again, that those skills are transferable in any kind of field, right? I mean, learning how to say words out loud or to write coherently or persuasively can be just useful in whatever path they choose to take in the future. Awesome. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I'm so glad that you were able to join us for this episode of Faculty in Focus. Virginia, congratulations for joining the select group of OSU Lima faculty invited to the Mug Club as part of our focus on faculty scholarship, both inside and outside of the classroom. Be sure to check out our other episodes of Faculty in Focus on the Ohio State Lima YouTube channel. From all of us here at Ohio State Lima, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Faculty in Focus. Until next time.